For my 38th birthday, my wife's mother gifted me divorce papers. From all of US, she announced at the restaurant. My wife recorded my reaction for their entertainment. I thanked her, signed them immediately, and walked out. She had no idea what I'd already done. You know what they say about turning 38? It's supposed to be just another year closer to 40, right? Well, let me tell you something about birthdays. They're supposed to involve cake, maybe some awkward singing, and your family pretending to care about you for exactly one day. What they're not supposed to involve is getting served divorce papers like you're some deadbeat who forgot to pay child support. But here I was, sitting in Riversong Bistro, this overpriced joint that serves $12 appetizers and calls them artisanal, staring at my mother-in-law Margaret Collins as she stood up like she was about to give the damn State of the Union address. The woman had this smug little smile plastered across her face, the kind that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your entire existence, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it." "From all of us," she announced, holding out this pink butterfly envelope like it was the Hope Diamond. Jesus Christ, pink butterflies. Even their choice of stationery was insulting. I mean, what kind of psychopath puts divorce papers in an envelope that looks like it should contain a 6-year-old's birthday party invitation? The whole table went dead quiet. You know that feeling when you walk into a surprise party, except instead of people yelling surprise, they're all waiting for you to have a mental breakdown? Yeah, that was the vibe. My wife Julia, soon-to-be ex-wife, apparently, had her phone out faster than a tourist at Times Square, angling it toward me like she was filming the next viral TikTok. Her brother Marcus was leaning forward with this shit-eating grin that made me want to throw my water glass at his perfectly groomed face. I tore open the envelope, and there it was in black and white. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Fancy legal jargon for "we're done here, buddy." The papers looked official as hell, all stamped and notarized and ready to go. These people had done their homework. I'll give them that. They'd probably been planning this little performance for weeks, maybe months. The thing is, when you're expecting something like this, and trust me, I was, it doesn't hit you the way they want it to. They were all sitting there like vultures waiting for me to cry, beg, maybe flip the table over, and cause a scene that would give them something to gossip about for the next 5 years. Margaret probably had her whole Bridge Club speech ready. You should have seen how he completely lost it at Riversong. Poor Julia, she's so much better off without him. But you know what I did instead? I pulled out my pen, the same Mont Blanc Julia had given me last Christmas, ironically enough, and signed those papers right there at the table. Didn't even read the fine print. Just scribbled my name on every line that said respondent, and slid the whole stack back toward Margaret like I was returning a bad meal. "Thank you," I said, standing up and adjusting my jacket. This is exactly what I needed. The silence that followed was absolutely delicious. You could have heard a pin drop in that overpriced restaurant. Julia's phone was still recording, but now she looked like she'd just watched someone kick a puppy. Marcus's grin had completely disappeared, replaced by this confused expression like he'd just solved a math problem and gotten the wrong answer. And Margaret? Oh, Margaret looked like someone had just told her that her precious country club membership had been revoked. That's it. Julia stammered, finally lowering her phone. "You're not going to fight this?" I looked at her, really looked at her, for what I knew would probably be the last time as her husband. 5 years of marriage, and she still thought she knew me. Still thought I was the same guy who'd bend over backward to make her family happy, who'd sit there and take their passive-aggressive comments with a smile. "Fight what, Julia? Your happiness." I shrugged. "If this is what you want, then congratulations. You got it." Marcus cleared his throat, clearly trying to salvage whatever this was supposed to be. "Look, man, this doesn't have to be." "Doesn't have to be what, Marcus?" "Easy. Too late for that." I pulled out my wallet and dropped a 50 on the table. This should cover my share of the bill. And the entertainment. I could feel every eye in that restaurant on me as I walked toward the exit. The other diners had probably figured out they were witnessing some kind of family drama. And let's be honest, people eat that stuff up like it's free cable. I could hear the whispers starting already. "Did you see that?" Just signed the papers and walked out. Cold as ice. But here's the thing they didn't know. The thing that Margaret and Julia and precious Marcus had no clue about. While they'd been sitting around planning this little birthday ambush, thinking they were so clever with their legal papers and their dramatic timing, I'd been 10 steps ahead of them. See, they thought they knew me. Thought I was just Julia's husband who runs a small business. That's how Margaret always introduced me at parties, with air quotes and everything. They thought I was some kind of underachiever who should be grateful to be part of their precious family. They thought I'd fall apart without them, that I'd come crawling back begging for another chance. What they didn't know was that their little envelope had just handed me the one thing I'd been waiting for: freedom. Complete, total, no strings attached freedom from their toxic little dynasty. As I pushed through the restaurant doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt lighter than I had in years. No more family dinners where I was the punchline. No more Margaret's condescending comments about my cute little company. No more pretending to laugh at Marcus's jokes about how real men work in corporate America. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd been saving for exactly this moment. "Claire," I said when my sister picked up. "It's done. They actually went through with it. Jesus, they really served you divorce papers at your birthday dinner. Pink butterfly envelope and everything. I'm telling you, these people have no sense of irony." Claire laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard in months. "So what now?" I looked back through the restaurant window. I could see Margaret gesticulating wildly, probably trying to explain to the table why their brilliant plan had just backfired spectacularly. Julia was staring at the signed papers like they might suddenly burst into flames. Marcus looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. "Now," I smiled, turning away from the window and walking toward my car. "Now the real fun begins. Because here's what Margaret Collins and her perfect little family were about to find out. When you try to destroy someone's life, you better make damn sure you actually can." And they had absolutely no idea what they'd just unleashed. 3 days before my birthday disaster at Riversong Bistro, I was having one of those days where everything goes wrong from the minute you wake up. You know the kind. Coffee maker breaks, traffic's a nightmare, and your biggest client decides they want to revisit the terms of a contract you've been working on for months. So when I pulled into my driveway at 2:30 in the afternoon instead of my usual 6 o'clock, all I wanted was to grab a beer, maybe catch the last half of whatever game was on, and pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. But apparently, the universe had other plans. I walked through the front door expecting the usual afternoon silence. Julia would be at her yoga class, or getting her nails done, or doing whatever it is that women who don't work do with their afternoons. Instead, I heard this weird shuffling sound coming from the dining room, like someone was frantically organizing papers. Now, let me paint you a picture of our dining room. It's this formal space that Julia insisted we needed because proper families have proper dining rooms. We've probably eaten in there maybe 6 times in 5 years of marriage, and most of those were when Margaret came over to judge our furniture choices. The rest of the time, it's basically a very expensive storage room for Julia's craft projects and whatever random crap accumulates when you have too much house and not enough purpose. So hearing activity in there was already weird. But what I saw when I peeked around the corner, that was straight up suspicious as hell. There was Margaret Collins, hunched over our dining table like some kind of evil secretary, wearing those reading glasses that made her look like a librarian who'd snap your head off for returning a book late. She had papers spread out everywhere, official-looking documents with letterheads and seals, and all that legal mumbo-jumbo that makes your stomach drop even when you're not doing anything wrong. But here's the kicker. She had a red pen in her hand, and she was marking up these papers like a teacher grading the worst essay she'd ever read. Making notes in the margins, circling things, drawing arrows, the whole 9 yards. This wasn't just reading. This was editing. This was strategizing. And sitting right next to her elbow was one of those festive birthday envelopes, pink with little butterflies all over it, just waiting to be filled. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, watching her work, before my brain caught up with what I was seeing. This wasn't some random paperwork. This wasn't Margaret helping Julia organize our insurance policies or updating our will. This was something else entirely, something that required secrecy and planning and apparently a lot of red ink. That's when I decided to make my presence known. "Hey, Margaret," I said, stepping into the room like I hadn't been standing there watching her little document editing session. "Didn't expect to see you here." Holy shit, you should have seen her reaction. The woman practically launched herself into orbit. Papers went flying, the red pen shot across the table like a tiny missile, and those reading glasses nearly flew off her face. For a split second, she looked exactly like what she was, someone who'd been caught red-handed doing something she definitely shouldn't have been doing. But Margaret Collins didn't get to be the queen bee of the Willowbrook Country Club by folding under pressure. Within about 3 seconds, she'd gathered up all those papers like she was shuffling a deck of cards, slid them into that butterfly envelope faster than a Vegas dealer, and put on that fake smile that could win Academy Awards. "Oh, hello, dear," she said, standing up and smoothing down her blouse like nothing had happened. "I didn't hear you come in. Early day," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual while my brain was doing backflips trying to process what I'd just witnessed. "What's all that?" "Just family paperwork," she said, clutching that envelope to her chest like it contained state secrets. "You know how it is. Always something that needs organizing. Family paperwork. Right. Because family paperwork definitely requires the kind of intensive red pen editing I just watched her doing. Because family paperwork definitely needs to be hidden in birthday card envelopes when the actual family member walks into the room." I nodded like I believed her, because what else was I going to do? Accuse my mother-in-law of plotting against me based on 30 seconds of suspicious behavior? That's the kind of thing that gets you labeled as paranoid and crazy, the kind of thing that gives people ammunition to use against you later. "Where's Julia?" I asked instead. "Oh, she'll be down in a minute," Margaret said, still holding that envelope like it might explode. "She's just finishing up a phone call." As if on cue, I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Julia appeared in the doorway a few seconds later. She took one look at the scene, me standing there, Margaret clutching her mysterious envelope, papers and pens scattered across the table. And I swear I could see some kind of silent communication pass between them. "Mom, I thought you were going to wait until..." Julia started, then caught herself. Hi, honey. You're home early." "Yeah, rough day at the office," I said, watching both of them carefully. "Your mom was just telling me about some family paperwork she's working on." Julia's eyes flicked to the envelope in Margaret's hands, then back to me. "Oh, that. Yeah, it's nothing important. Just some stuff for Dad's estate." Now, Julia's dad had been dead for 3 years. 3 years. And in all that time, I'd never once seen Margaret working on estate paperwork that required the kind of intense focus I'd just witnessed. "But sure, let's go with that story." "Well, I'll let you two finish up," I said, grabbing a beer from the fridge and heading toward the living room. "Let me know if you need anything." But as I walked away, I could hear them whispering behind me. Urgent, hushed tones that people use when they're discussing things they don't want overheard. I caught fragments. "Thought he'd be at work until 6. And, need to be more careful." And something that sounded suspiciously like, "birthday." I settled into my recliner, cracked open my beer, and pretended to watch ESPN while my mind raced through possibilities. What kind of family paperwork requires that level of secrecy? What kind of documents need to be edited with a red pen and hidden in birthday card envelopes? And why did Julia look like she'd been caught stealing candy when she saw me standing there? The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. This wasn't about her dad's estate. This wasn't about organizing insurance policies or updating emergency contacts. This was about me. Had to be. Because what else would require that kind of cloak-and-dagger behavior in my own damn house? Over the next hour, I watched Margaret leave, hugging that envelope like it contained the crown jewels. I watched Julia pace around the house, checking her phone every few minutes like she was waiting for some kind of confirmation. I watched both of them avoid making eye contact with me, speaking in those overly cheerful tones that people use when they're trying to act normal and failing miserably. And you know what? I let them think they'd gotten away with it. I let them believe I was clueless, that I hadn't seen anything suspicious, that I was just the oblivious husband who came home early and interrupted their little planning session. But inside, I was already 3 moves ahead. Because if Margaret Collins and my dear wife Julia thought they were going to blindside me with whatever they'd been cooking up, they had another thing coming. Game on, ladies. Game fucking on. Let me tell you something about the Collins family. They perfected the art of making someone feel like absolute garbage while smiling the entire time. It's like a superpower, except instead of fighting crime, they use it to slowly crush your soul at dinner parties. Margaret Collins had despised me from day one. I'm talking about the very first time Julia brought me home to meet the family, back when we were still in that honeymoon phase where you think love conquers all in family drama. It's just something that happens to other people. What a naive little shit I was. I remember walking into their house. This massive colonial in the fancy part of town with the circular driveway and the perfectly manicured lawn that probably cost more to maintain than most people's salaries. Margaret opened the door wearing this smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, looked me up and down like she was evaluating livestock, and said, "So you're the young man Julia's been telling us about." Even then, I could hear the disappointment in her voice. Like Julia had been hyping up some kind of Prince Charming, and instead she got stuck with, well, me. But the real fun started when we got to parties. Oh man, the parties. The Collins family loved their social gatherings, charity fundraisers, country club events, neighborhood barbecues where everyone compared their kids' accomplishments and tried to one-up each other with stories about their latest vacations to Europe. At every single one of these events, Margaret would introduce me the exact same way. "This is Julia's husband. He runs a small business." And she'd say small business, like it was some kind of communicable disease, with this tone that suggested I was probably selling bootleg DVDs out of the trunk of my car. It didn't matter that I was actually building something, that Ridgewell Solutions was growing every year, that I was working my ass off to create something meaningful. To Margaret, if it wasn't a Fortune 500 company with a corner office and a secretary, it wasn't worth mentioning. And God forbid I tried to explain what my company actually did. Logistics and supply chain management aren't exactly cocktail party conversation, apparently. How? Entrepreneurial, she'd say, like being an entrepreneur was just a fancy way of saying unemployed. Then she'd quickly change the subject to something more impressive, like how Marcus had just gotten another promotion at his big corporate job, or how their neighbor's son was doing so well at his law firm. And Julia, my loving, supportive wife? She'd just stand there nodding along, sometimes even laughing at her mother's passive-aggressive comments. Not once, not fucking once, did she ever jump in to defend me or correct her mother's dismissive attitude. Not when Margaret joked about how I probably couldn't afford to take Julia on proper vacations. Not when she made comments about how some people weren't cut out for the corporate world. Not even when she straight up asked Julia, right in front of me, if she ever missed dating successful men. The worst part was watching Julia's face during these interactions. At first, she'd look uncomfortable, maybe give me an apologetic smile like she was sorry her mother was being such a bitch. But over time, that discomfort turned into something else. She started looking at me the way Margaret did, like I was some kind of disappointing consolation prize she'd settled for. Marcus was even worse, if that's possible. Julia's younger brother had landed this cushy job at some tech company right out of college, and he never let anyone forget it. Every family gathering was like a one-man show where Marcus got to perform his "look how successful I am" routine for an audience that ate it up like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. "So, still doing the logistics thing?" He'd ask me, with this smirk that made me want to punch his perfectly straight teeth. "That's cool, man. I mean, someone's got to handle the behind-the-scenes stuff, right?" Behind-the-scenes stuff. Like I was some kind of janitor cleaning up after the real professionals. And then he'd launch into stories about his latest project, using all the corporate buzzwords he'd learned in business school. "We're really disrupting the paradigm," he'd say, or "it's all about leveraging synergies to maximize our value proposition." The whole family would nod along like he was speaking ancient wisdom instead of spouting the same MBA bullshit that every corporate drone learns in their first week. The comparisons were endless and brutal. At Christmas dinner, Margaret would announce how Marcus had gotten another raise, then turn to me and ask how business was going, with air quotes and everything. At Julia's birthday party, she'd make a big show of praising Marcus for taking his girlfriend on some expensive trip to Napa Valley, then comment about how some couples prefer to stay closer to home, looking directly at Julia and me like we were too poor or too unambitious to do anything interesting. But you know what really killed me? The way Julia started buying into it. Slowly, gradually, she stopped defending my work and started making her own little comments. "Maybe you should think about getting a real job," she'd say after particularly brutal family dinners. "I mean, Marcus makes twice what you do, and he gets benefits. Benefits, like health insurance and a 401k were the measure of a man's worth." She started rolling her eyes when I'd get excited about a new contract or a business opportunity. Started sighing when I'd work late or take weekend calls. Started looking at me like I was holding her back from the life she deserved, the life Marcus had, the life her mother constantly reminded her that other people's husbands provided. Every family dinner became a performance where I was the opening act for the Marcus show. He'd talk about his company's IPO plans, his stock options, his corner office with the view of downtown. The whole family would hang on every word like he was reporting live from the moon. And me? I got to sit there and smile while they praised him for doing exactly what millions of other corporate drones do every day: showing up, following orders, and collecting a paycheck. Meanwhile, I was out there building something from scratch, creating jobs, solving problems, taking real risks. But because it didn't come with a fancy title and a corporate expense account, it didn't count. The crazy part was, I actually liked Marcus at first, before I realized what a pretentious asshole he'd become, back when he was just Julia's annoying little brother instead of the golden child who could do no wrong. But success had gone to his head, and Margaret's constant praise had turned him into this smug, condescending prick who thought his corporate job made him better than everyone else. "You know," he said to me once at a barbecue, "if you ever want to get serious about your career, I could probably get you an interview at my company. I mean, they're always looking for people to handle the operational stuff." Operational stuff. Like I was applying to be his assistant. But the absolute worst part, the thing that really drove the knife home, was watching Julia transform from the woman who'd fallen in love with my ambition and drive into someone who saw those same qualities as embarrassing flaws. She stopped asking about my work, stopped celebrating when I landed big contracts, stopped believing that what I was building mattered. Instead, she started looking at other couples at parties, comparing what their husbands did for a living, wondering out loud why she couldn't have the same lifestyle as her friends. The woman who'd once told me she loved my independence and entrepreneurial spirit was now asking why I couldn't just get a normal job like everyone else. And through it all, Margaret kept chipping away, one dinner party at a time, one passive-aggressive comment at a time, until she'd successfully convinced her daughter that she'd married beneath her station. Mission accomplished, I guess. You know how they say the straw that breaks the camel's back? Well, my straw wasn't even a straw. It was more like a fucking telephone pole dropped from orbit. And it happened on a Tuesday night in March, when I was supposed to be the invisible husband minding his own business, while the real adults handled the important stuff. I'd been working late in my home office, grinding through some contract proposals for a potential government deal that could triple my company's revenue. Not that anyone in this house gave a damn about that. To them, I was just the guy who disappeared into the spare bedroom every night to play with his little business, like I was building model airplanes instead of running a legitimate company. Around 10:30, I decided to grab a beer from the kitchen and maybe catch the late-night highlights. As I walked past the living room, I could hear Julia on the phone, and something about her tone made me stop. She was using that low, conspiratorial voice that people use when they're discussing secrets. The kind of voice that immediately makes you want to know what the hell they're talking about. "I know, Mom," she was saying, and I could practically hear Margaret's voice through the phone, poisoning the conversation from 20 miles away. "He's holding me back. I can see that now." I stood there in the hallway, beer forgotten, feeling like someone had just punched me in the gut. Holding her back? From what exactly? From sitting around the house all day, spending money she didn't earn? From going to lunch with her vapid friends and complaining about how boring her life was? "Marcus's friend owns the company," Julia continued, and now I was fully eavesdropping, pressed against the wall like some kind of spy movie cliché. "He says there's a position opening up in their marketing department that would be perfect for someone with my background." Her background. Right. Julia had a communications degree from a state school and exactly 0 years of work experience since we'd gotten married. But apparently, that qualified her for some marketing position at whatever company Marcus's buddy ran. Nepotism at its finest. "It pays really well, too," she said, and I could hear the excitement creeping into her voice. Like, really well. More than enough to support myself, you know? Support herself. Jesus Christ. She was already planning her exit strategy, calculating how much money she'd need to ditch her disappointing husband and start fresh. And she was doing it with help from Marcus and his corporate connections, naturally. "I just need to wait for the right time," Julia went on. "Maybe after his birthday? I don't want to ruin his special day or anything." How fucking considerate of her. Don't ruin my birthday by leaving me. Wait until after the cake and presents to drop the bomb. That's real class right there. "No, Mom, I'm not going to just walk away with nothing," she said. and now her voice took on this calculating edge that I'd never heard before. I've been married to him for 5 years. I deserve something for putting up with, well, you know, his lack of ambition, his stubbornness about staying in that dead-end business. Dead-end business. The company I'd built from scratch, the thing I poured my heart and soul into every single day, reduced to a dead-end business by my loving wife and her poisonous mother. Marcus says his lawyer friend could help with that, Julia continued. Make sure I get what I'm entitled to. Half the house, alimony, maybe even part of his business if we can prove I contributed to its success somehow. Part of my business. They wanted to take a piece of the company I'd built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The company they'd spent years dismissing and belittling was suddenly valuable enough to steal when it served their purposes. It's just a matter of time before everything's official, she said, and I could hear her moving around the living room, probably pacing the way she did when she got excited about something. I mean, I've already been talking to David, Marcus's friend, about the position. He's very interested in what I could bring to the company. David. She was already on a first-name basis with her future boss, the guy who was going to rescue her from her terrible life with her underachieving husband. I wondered if Marcus had set up that introduction personally, or if Margaret had orchestrated the whole thing from behind the scenes. I know. Julia laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. I should have listened to you years ago. You tried to warn me about marrying someone so unestablished. But you know how I was back then. I thought love was enough. Love was enough. Past tense. Because apparently, whatever I'd thought we'd had, wasn't love anymore. It was just an inconvenient obstacle standing between Julia and the life she deserved. Well, better late than never, right? She said. And it's not like he'll be surprised. I mean, he has to know this isn't working. We barely talk anymore. We don't have anything in common, and God knows the physical side of things is. She trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. Apparently, our sex life was now part of the evidence for why she needed to escape this horrible marriage. Nothing like having your wife discuss your bedroom performance with your mother-in-law to really drive the humiliation home. Marcus thinks I should just rip the Band-Aid off, Julia said. But I want to do this right, you know? Clean and simple. No drama, no fighting. Just a quick divorce, and everyone moves on with their lives. Clean and simple. A quick divorce. Like 5 years of marriage could be dismissed as easily as returning a sweater that didn't fit right. I just need to be smart about it, she continued. Make sure I have everything lined up first. The job, the lawyer, maybe even an apartment. I don't want to depend on him for anything during the transition. The transition. She'd already planned out her entire post-marriage life, complete with a new job courtesy of Marcus's connections and legal advice from yet another friend of the family. Meanwhile, I was supposed to be the clueless husband who never saw it coming. You're right, Mom, Julia said, and now she sounded almost giddy with anticipation. This is going to be the best thing that ever happened to me. I can finally start living the life I was meant to have. The life she was meant to have. Not the life we were building together, not the partnership I'd thought we had, but some fantasy existence where she was married to a guy like Marcus instead of stuck with a loser like me. I stood there in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few more minutes, listening to my wife plan my destruction with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for vacation planning. She was going to leave me, take half of everything I'd worked for, and do it all with a smile while her family cheered her on from the sidelines. When she finally hung up, I crept back to my office and closed the door, my hands shaking as I sat down at my desk. For the first time in years, I felt completely alone in my own house. The woman sleeping in my bed, eating food I paid for, living in a house I'd bought, was actively plotting against me with the full support of her toxic family. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my office chair, staring at my computer screen, replaying every word of that conversation over and over again. Julia thought she was being so clever, so strategic. She had no idea that her clueless husband had just heard every detail of her brilliant plan. But here's the thing about underestimating people. Sometimes it comes back to bite you in the ass. While Julia was busy planning her escape with help from Marcus and Margaret, I was already 10 steps ahead of her, building something they couldn't even imagine. They wanted to play games? Fine. Game on. Here's the thing about being underestimated. It's actually a hell of a superpower when you know how to use it. While Margaret Collins was busy telling everyone at her bridge club about her daughter's poor choice in husbands, and Julia was rolling her eyes every time I mentioned a new contract, I was quietly building an empire right under their noses. See, they were so obsessed with appearances, so focused on corporate titles and corner offices, that they completely missed what was actually happening in their own house. To them, I was just the guy who disappeared into the spare bedroom every night to work on his cute little logistics company. They had no idea that their small business owner was about to become richer than Marcus would ever dream of being. It started about 4 years ago, right around the time Margaret's passive-aggressive comments were reaching peak toxicity. I'd been running Ridgewell Solutions for 6 years at that point, and we were doing okay. Not spectacular, but solid enough to pay the bills and keep Julia in the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. But, okay, wasn't going to cut it anymore. Not when I had to listen to Marcus brag about his 6-figure salary every damn weekend. So I decided to get serious. Really serious. The first move was acquiring Peterson Freight, a smaller company that was struggling with cash flow but had some killer government connections. The owner, Bill Peterson, was about ready to retire anyway, and I made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Not because I threw ridiculous money at him. I wasn't exactly swimming in cash back then, but because I offered him something better. A partnership deal where he'd stay on as a consultant and still get a cut of the profits. Julia barely noticed when I told her about the acquisition. "That's nice, honey," she said, not even looking up from her phone. "Does this mean you'll be working even later now?" If she'd bothered to ask questions, real questions about what Peterson Freight brought to the table, she might have realized that Bill Peterson had connections with the Department of Defense. Government contracts that could turn a mid-sized logistics company into something much, much bigger. But Julia didn't ask questions. Neither did Margaret. Neither did Marcus, who was too busy humble bragging about his latest promotion to pay attention to what his loser brother-in-law was actually doing. The second acquisition came 18 months later, Crawford Supply Chain, a company that specialized in cold storage and pharmaceutical logistics. This one was trickier because Crawford was actually profitable, but they'd gotten themselves into some legal trouble with a contamination scare that wasn't even their fault. The media had crucified them, their stock price tanked, and suddenly they were willing to sell for about 60 cents on the dollar. I borrowed against everything I had, the house, my personal savings, even my fucking car, to make that deal happen. It was the kind of risk that keeps you awake at night, the kind of bet that could either make you rich or destroy your life completely. Julia noticed the paperwork that time, mainly because I had documents spread all over the dining room table for about 2 weeks while my lawyers and accountants worked out the details. "What's all this?" she asked one morning, stepping around stacks of contracts like they were piles of dirty laundry. "Just expanding the business," I told her. "Nothing you need to worry about." "Good," she said, grabbing her coffee and heading out to meet her friends for lunch. "As long as it doesn't affect our finances." Our finances, right. Because the money I was risking, money I'd earned, was somehow our money, but the business decisions were mine alone to worry about. If she'd stuck around for 5 more minutes, she might have learned that Crawford Supply Chain had a contract with 3 major pharmaceutical companies and a partnership with FedEx that was worth about $12 million annually. But Julia had more important things to do, like getting her nails done and complaining to her friends about how boring her husband's work was. The real game changer came 2 years ago, a Department of Defense contract for logistics support in Southeast Asia. It was the kind of deal that most small companies never even hear about, let alone compete for. But thanks to Bill Peterson's connections and Crawford's pharmaceutical expertise, Ridgewell Solutions was suddenly in the running for a contract worth $75 million over 3 years. The bidding process took 8 months. 8 months of presentations, security clearances, site visits, and enough paperwork to deforest half of Oregon. I was working 16-hour days, flying to Washington twice a week, and basically living on coffee and determination. And what did my loving family think I was doing during this time? "He's been so stressed lately," I overheard Julia telling Margaret one afternoon. "I think his little business is having problems. Maybe he should consider getting a real job before things get too bad." A real job. While I was competing for the biggest government contract in my company's history, my wife was suggesting I should apply to work for someone else. The day I got the call that we'd won the contract, I was sitting in my office at home, surrounded by 3 months' worth of financial projections and contingency plans. When the Pentagon procurement officer told me the news, I literally had to ask him to repeat it because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. $75 million. Over 3 years. With options for renewal that could double that amount. I hung up the phone and just sat there for about 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of a single phone call, Ridgewell Solutions had gone from a mid-sized logistics company to a major government contractor. We were going to need to hire 60 new employees, lease additional warehouse space, and probably buy a fleet of trucks just to handle the first year of the contract. When Julia came home that evening, I was still sitting in my office, staring at the contract documents that had been emailed over for my signature. "How was your day?" she asked from the doorway, not really waiting for an answer before launching into a story about some drama at her yoga class. "Pretty good," I said. "We landed a big contract." "That's nice," she replied, already walking away. "What do you want for dinner?" "A $75 million contract," and she responded like I'd told her I'd organized my sock drawer. But that was just the beginning. Once word got out that Ridgewell Solutions was handling major Defense Department logistics, other opportunities started falling into my lap. Private sector contracts with companies that needed someone who could handle sensitive, high-security supply chain management. International deals with allies who were looking for American companies with government credentials. Within 6 months of winning that first Pentagon contract, my company's valuation had increased by roughly 3,000%. We went from being a decent-sized regional player to a nationally recognized logistics contractor practically overnight. And through all of this, through every late-night strategy session, every high-stakes presentation, every nerve-wracking negotiation, my wife and her family continued to treat me like some kind of underachieving disappointment who couldn't figure out how to get a real job. The best part? I set up a trust fund under my sister Claire's name, moving most of my assets out of reach of any potential divorce proceedings. Not because I was planning to leave Julia, but because I'd learned to think strategically about everything. Claire didn't ask questions when I explained the setup to her. She just smiled and said, "About time you started protecting yourself." So while Margaret was at her bridge club complaining about her daughter's unsuccessful husband, and Julia was daydreaming about the life she could have with someone like Marcus, I was quietly becoming wealthier than any of them could imagine. The really ironic part? If they'd just treated me with a basic level of respect, if they'd shown even mild interest in what I was building, they could have been part of something amazing. Instead, their obsession with status and appearances blinded them to the empire growing right under their noses. Their loss was about to become my freedom. You know that old saying about revenge being a dish best served cold? Well, I was about to open a 5-star restaurant specializing in Arctic cuisine because what I had planned for the Collins family was going to be colder than a penguin's ass in Antarctica. After overhearing Julia's little phone conversation with Margaret, the one where they casually discussed dismantling my life like they were planning a fucking garage sale, I realized I had 2 choices. I could either confront them like some kind of emotional amateur and give them time to adjust their strategy, or I could play chess while they were still figuring out how to use checkers pieces. Guess which option I chose? The next morning, while Julia was at her Pilates class pretending to exercise, I called my lawyer. Not the family lawyer, the guy we'd used for our house purchase and wills, but my business attorney, Rebecca Martinez. Rebecca was the kind of lawyer who could find loopholes in the 10 Commandments and make Moses thank her for the legal advice. "I need to discuss some asset protection strategies," I told her when she picked up. Hypothetically speaking, Rebecca had been handling my business legal work for 3 years, so she knew exactly what hypothetically speaking meant. It meant someone was about to get screwed, and it wasn't going to be her client. "How hypothetical are we talking?" she asked. "Let's say someone might try to claim half of everything I've built, including parts of my business, in the very near future." There was a pause, then that predatory chuckle that Rebecca reserved for cases where she got to destroy people legally. "How near are we talking?" "Could be any day now." "Well then, we better schedule a meeting. Today if possible." 3 hours later, I was sitting in Rebecca's downtown office, looking out at the city skyline while she laid out a strategy that was so beautifully ruthless it almost brought tears to my eyes. "First thing," she said, pulling out a legal pad and starting to scribble notes, "we move everything into protected accounts. Business assets go into the corporate trust, personal investments get transferred to offshore holdings, and your real estate gets restructured under the company's name. How long will that take? If we push hard? About a week. But here's the beautiful part. Everything we're doing is completely legal. We're not hiding assets. We're reorganizing them for legitimate business and tax purposes. Your wife's theoretical lawyer won't be able to touch any of it. I love this woman. Not romantically. Rebecca was happily married to a federal judge. But professionally, she was like watching a master artist paint with lawsuits and loopholes. What about the house? I asked. Easy. Ridgewell Solutions needs a corporate headquarters, right? The house becomes company property, leased back to you at market rate. Completely legitimate business expense, totally protected from any marital claims. While Rebecca worked on the legal side, I had my own preparations to make. That evening, I opened my laptop and started updating my will. The old version left everything to Julia, because that's what you do when you're married and stupidly believe your wife actually loves you. The new version was a masterpiece of strategic distribution. Everything, and I mean everything, went to my niece Lily, Claire's daughter. The kid was only 16, but she was smart as hell and had never once treated me like a disappointment. Plus, Claire would manage the inheritance until Lily turned 25, which meant my sister would have control over a fortune that would make the Collins family's heads explode. I left Julia exactly $1. Not because I'm petty. Okay, maybe I'm a little petty, but because leaving someone nothing in a will can be contested. Leaving them $1? That's a clear message that says, I remembered you existed, and I decided you were worth exactly this much. The best part was the letter I attached to the will, explaining my reasoning. I detailed every insult, every dismissive comment, every time Julia had chosen her family's opinion over her husband's feelings. It was like a greatest hits album of marital disrespect, all documented with dates and witnesses. But I didn't stop there. Oh no, I was just getting warmed up. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly moved money around like I was running some kind of financial shell game. The joint checking account that Julia used for her daily expenses, I left just enough in there to cover the monthly bills, moving everything else into business accounts that she didn't even know existed. Our savings account, the one she thought contained about $40,000, that money got invested in a new subsidiary of Ridgewell Solutions, a company I created specifically to hold personal assets. Technically, we were broke. Practically, I was richer than ever. The credit cards were even more fun. I paid them all off and then called the companies to update our financial information. Since I was now technically unemployed, all my income was coming through corporate distributions. Julia's applications for new credit were going to be a real adventure. Meanwhile, I kept playing the part of the clueless husband beautifully. I asked Julia about her day, listened to her complain about her friend's drama, and pretended to care when she mentioned that Marcus was thinking about buying a new car, all while I was systematically dismantling every financial advantage she thought she'd have in the divorce. The real stroke of genius came when I restructured my business ownership. Instead of being the sole owner of Ridgewell Solutions, I created a holding company based in Delaware, because Delaware corporate law is basically designed to protect rich people from their problems, and transferred all my shares to that entity. On paper, I owned a management consulting firm that paid me a modest salary. In reality, I controlled a logistics empire worth tens of millions of dollars. But good luck explaining that distinction to a divorce court, especially when all the paperwork showed a struggling small business owner who barely made enough to cover his expenses. Julia had no idea that while she was planning to take half of everything, I was making sure there wouldn't be anything left to take. She thought she was being so clever, lining up her new job through Marcus's connections, getting legal advice from her family's lawyer friends, plotting her escape route like some kind of suburban mastermind. But here's what she didn't understand. I'd been planning for this possibility from the moment I realized what kind of family I'd married into. Every business decision, every investment, every legal structure I'd built over the past 4 years had been designed with one goal in mind: protecting what I'd earned from people who didn't deserve it. The night before my birthday, I sat in my office reviewing all the paperwork Rebecca had prepared. Asset transfers, corporate restructuring documents, updated insurance policies, new account statements. It was like looking at the blueprints for the most beautiful revenge plot ever conceived. Julia was upstairs getting ready for bed, probably texting with Margaret about their big surprise for tomorrow night. They had no idea that their victim had spent 2 weeks preparing for war while they were still playing dress-up. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the good stuff, a bottle of Macallan 18 that Julia always said was too expensive for regular occasions, and raised a toast to my reflection in the dark window. "Happy birthday to me," I said out loud. "This is going to be fun." The 3 days leading up to my 38th birthday were like watching a really bad spy movie where all the secret agents might as well have been wearing neon signs that said, "We're plotting against you." The whole house had this weird energy, like everyone was walking around with loaded guns and trying to act casual about it. Julia was the worst actress in this little production. The woman who'd barely acknowledged my existence for the past 6 months was suddenly Miss Sunshine, practically skipping around the house like she'd won the fucking lottery. She kept humming, actually humming, while she did mundane things like loading the dishwasher or folding laundry, which was suspicious as hell because Julia hadn't been happy about household chores since approximately never. "You seem cheerful," I said on Monday morning, watching her practically dance around the kitchen while making coffee. "Oh, I'm just excited about your birthday," she said, giving me this bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom has something really special planned." Something really special. Right. I bet she did. The phone calls were constant and obvious. Every time I walked into a room, someone would quickly hang up or switch to talking about the weather or what they were having for lunch. Margaret called at least 6 times a day, and Julia would take these calls in different rooms of the house, speaking in those hushed, conspiratorial tones that made it clear they weren't discussing birthday cake flavors. Tuesday afternoon, I was in the garage pretending to organize my tools when I heard Julia on the deck, pacing back and forth while she talked to someone on her phone. No, it has to be perfect," she was saying. "We only get one chance to do this right, and I want to make sure he knows exactly how we all feel about the situation, how they all felt about the situation. Jesus, they weren't even trying to be subtle. Marcus, I need you to be there," she continued, and now I could hear the excitement building in her voice. "This is going to be a family moment, and I want everyone to see his reaction." His reaction. They were planning to record my humiliation, probably so they could watch it later for entertainment. I had to give them credit for thoroughness, even if they sucked at operational security. "Evelyn's coming too, right?" Julia asked. "Good. I want him to understand that this isn't just coming from me and Mom. This is a family decision. A family decision. Like they'd held a fucking vote and decided unanimously that I needed to be removed from the Collins family tree." The fact that Evelyn was involved was particularly rich. Julia's older sister had spent years pretending to be neutral in family drama, playing the role of the sensible one who stayed out of conflicts. But apparently, even Switzerland had picked a side in this war. Wednesday morning brought the most obvious sign, yet that something was brewing. I came downstairs to find Margaret sitting at my kitchen table at 7:30 in the morning, fully dressed, and made up like she had a job interview, drinking coffee and reading through what looked suspiciously like legal documents. "Morning, Margaret," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee and trying to act like finding my mother-in-law in my kitchen before 8 a.m. was totally normal. "Oh, good morning, dear," she said, quickly flipping the papers over so I couldn't see what she was reading. "I hope you don't mind. Julia gave me a key so I could help with the birthday preparations." Birthday preparations that required her to be here at dawn, apparently, and that involved reading legal documents. Sure, that made perfect sense. "Anything I can help with?" I offered, just to watch her squirm. "Oh no, she said quickly, gathering up her papers and stuffing them into her purse like they were state secrets. "It's a surprise, remember? You just focus on being excited for tomorrow night." Being excited for tomorrow night. Right. I should be thrilled about my own execution. The whole day continued like that. Marcus showed up around lunchtime, supposedly to hang out, but actually to scope out the situation and probably coordinate final details. He kept looking at me like he was trying to memorize my face, which was creepy as hell. "So, 38, huh?" he said while we were both in the kitchen grabbing beers. "Big year coming up." "I guess," I replied. Though honestly, birthdays don't feel as important once you hit your 30s. "Oh, I don't know about that," Marcus said with this weird smirk. "I think this one's going to be pretty memorable for you." Memorable? Yeah, I bet it would be. That evening, Julia announced that we were going to River Song Bistro for my birthday dinner, which was interesting because Julia had always said the place was overpriced and pretentious. When I'd suggested going there for our anniversary last year, she'd rolled her eyes and said we couldn't afford to waste money on fancy restaurants that charge $15 for a salad. But apparently, my birthday was special enough to justify the expense. Or maybe they figured it was worth the cost to have a public venue for their big performance. I made reservations for 6 people, Julia said, which was also suspicious because our usual family dinners were just the 3 of us. Me, Julia, and whatever toxic energy Margaret brought to the table. 6 people? I asked. Well, Mom, of course. And Marcus. And Evelyn said she could make it, which is great because you know how busy she's been with work. Plus her husband Dave. The whole gang, in other words. Everyone who'd been whispering behind my back for months, all gathered together to witness whatever grand finale they had planned. Should be fun, I said, and Julia's face lit up like I'd just agreed to donate a kidney. Oh, it will be, she said. Mom has put so much thought into this. She really wants to make sure it's a night you'll never forget. A night I'd never forget. The woman who'd spent 5 years treating me like a disappointment was suddenly concerned about making my birthday memorable. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Wednesday night, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous. I was way past nervous and well into that calm, almost zen-like state that comes right before a major battle. I lay in bed listening to Julia breathe beside me, probably dreaming about her new life with Marcus's corporate friends, and I felt nothing but pity for how completely she'd underestimated me. They thought they were so clever, so strategic. They'd spent weeks planning this elaborate takedown, coordinating schedules, getting their legal ducks in a row, probably even practicing their lines in the mirror. Margaret had probably been fantasizing about this moment for years, the night she'd finally get to destroy the son-in-law who'd never been good enough for her precious daughter. But what they didn't know, what none of them suspected, was that their victim had been preparing for this war longer than they'd been planning it. While they were focused on their little birthday ambush, I'd been building the kind of defense system that could withstand a nuclear attack. Thursday morning arrived gray and rainy, which seemed appropriate for what was supposed to be the day my old life ended. Julia woke up practically vibrating with excitement, humming again while she got ready for her morning workout. "Happy birthday, honey," she said, giving me a kiss that felt more like a goodbye than a celebration. "Thanks," I said, looking forward to tonight. And you know what? I really was. Because while Julia and Margaret and the rest of the Collins family were planning to end my story, I was about to show them that they'd actually written the first chapter of theirs. Game time was finally here. Riversong Bistro on a Thursday night was exactly what you'd expect from a restaurant that charges $28 for chicken breast and calls it artisanal. The lighting was dim enough to hide the disappointment in your wallet. The music was that generic jazz that's supposed to make you feel sophisticated, and the waitstaff moved around like they were personally offended that you couldn't afford to eat somewhere better. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, this overpriced den of culinary pretension was about to become the stage for the most spectacular family drama in recent Collins history. We arrived fashionably on time, because God forbid the Collins family show up anywhere without making an entrance. And I have to admit, watching everyone try to act normal was better entertainment than anything they could have put on the menu. Marcus kept checking his watch like he was timing a bomb. Evelyn looked like she was attending a funeral, and Dave, Evelyn's husband, just seemed confused about why he'd been dragged into whatever this was. Margaret, of course, was in full performance mode. She'd dressed for the occasion in what I can only describe as courtroom chic, a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's rent, paired with the kind of jewelry that screamed, "I have money, and I'm not afraid to use it as a weapon." "Doesn't everyone look wonderful tonight?" she announced as we settled into our seats, like we were at a wedding instead of what was clearly going to be a public execution. Julia was practically bouncing in her chair, fidgeting with her phone and positioning it at different angles. At first, I thought she was just being her usual social media-obsessed self, but then I noticed she kept angling the camera toward me. This wasn't Instagram content she was planning. This was evidence collection. "Are you recording something?" I asked, just to watch her panic. "Oh, just some family memories," she said, giving me that fake smile again. "You know how I like to document special occasions." Special occasions. Right. Like my execution was going to make it into the family photo album. The appetizers arrived, and I have to give the Collins family credit. They committed to the performance. Margaret ordered the most expensive starter on the menu. Marcus launched into some story about his latest work triumph, and Evelyn actually managed to carry on a conversation about her kids' soccer season without looking like she was about to throw up. But I could see the tension underneath it all. The way Julia kept glancing at her mother, waiting for some kind of signal. The way Marcus would start to say something and then catch himself, like he was afraid of spoiling the surprise. The way Evelyn kept looking at me with this guilty expression, like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. Dave, bless his heart, was completely oblivious to the undercurrents. He just sat there eating bread and making small talk about the weather, probably wondering why his wife had insisted he dress up for dinner with her weird in-laws. So, Margaret said as our entrees arrived, and something about her tone made everyone stop talking at once. I think this is the perfect time for birthday gifts. Here we go. Showtime. The whole table went quiet except for the soft jazz and the murmur of other diners who had no idea they were about to witness something that would probably end up as a story people told at parties for years to come. Margaret reached into her purse, the same purse she'd been clutching all week like it contained nuclear launch codes, and pulled out that pink butterfly envelope. The same envelope I'd washed her stuff full of legal documents 3 days earlier. The same envelope that Julia thought was going to ruin my life. From all of us, Margaret announced, standing up and holding the envelope like she was presenting an Academy Award. Her voice carried just enough to make the nearby tables turn and look, which was probably exactly what she wanted. Julia's phone was definitely recording now, and I could see Marcus leaning forward with barely contained excitement. Evelyn looked like she might be sick, and Dave just seemed confused about why everyone was acting so weird about a birthday card. I took the envelope, and I have to admit, there was something almost ceremonial about the moment. This was it, the culmination of months of planning, years of resentment, and probably decades of Margaret's disappointment in her daughter's choice of husband. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted down with all their hopes and expectations. They wanted me to fall apart, to beg, to make a scene that would justify everything they'd done and everything they thought about me. Instead, I opened it like it was any other birthday card. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words jumped off the page in bold, official letters. Below that, a bunch of legal jargon that basically boiled down to, Julia wants half your stuff and monthly payments for the rest of your natural life. I looked around the table at their expectant faces. Julia had stopped pretending to eat and was holding her phone steady, recording my reaction for posterity. Marcus was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Margaret stood there like a prosecutor who'd just presented the smoking gun that would convict the defendant. And you know what I did? I signed the papers, right there at the table, using the same Mont Blanc pen Julia had given me for Christmas. I signed every page that required my signature, neat and legible, like I was endorsing a check. The silence that followed was absolutely beautiful. You could have heard a pin drop in that restaurant, which was impressive considering the ambient noise of 30 other conversations happening around us. Julia's phone slipped from her hands and clattered onto the table. Marcus's grin disappeared so fast, it was like someone had hit a reset button on his face. Evelyn actually gasped, and Dave looked around the table like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke he wasn't getting. But Margaret was the best. The woman who'd orchestrated this entire performance, who'd probably spent weeks imagining my humiliation, just stood there with her mouth hanging open like she'd forgotten how to speak. "Thank you," I said, sliding the signed papers back into the pink envelope and handing it to Margaret. "This is exactly what I needed." I stood up, pulled out my wallet, and dropped a $100 bill on the table, more than enough to cover my share of the meal and the tip. "This should take care of everything," I said, straightening my jacket. "And Margaret, I have to say, this was perfectly planned. Really, just perfect timing." The entire restaurant was watching now. Other diners had stopped their conversations to stare at our table, probably trying to figure out what kind of family drama they'd just witnessed. The waitstaff was hovering nearby, unsure whether they should intervene or just let the show continue. Julia finally found her voice. That's it. You're not going to fight this? You're not going to try to work things out?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but pity. She'd spent so much time planning my destruction that she'd never considered the possibility that I might actually want to be destroyed. That her divorce papers weren't a weapon, but a gift. Fight what, Julia? Your happiness? If this is what you want, then congratulations. You got it. Marcus started to say something, probably trying to salvage whatever this was supposed to accomplish, but I cut him off. Marcus, tell your friend David that Julia is going to be a wonderful addition to his marketing team. I'm sure she'll fit right in. The look of shock on his face was priceless. They thought they'd been so clever, so secretive. They had no idea that I'd been listening to their phone calls and planning sessions for weeks. I walked toward the exit, leaving behind a table full of people who just realized their brilliant plan had somehow backfired spectacularly. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispers, chairs scraping, and the sound of Margaret trying to explain to the other diners that everything was fine, just a family misunderstanding. But as I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, I couldn't help but smile. Act 1 was complete. Now it was time for my encore. I was halfway to my car when I heard the restaurant door slam behind me and footsteps on the pavement. Part of me wanted to keep walking, to let them stew in their confusion while I drove home and celebrated my newfound freedom with that bottle of Macallan. But the other part of me, the part that had been planning this moment for weeks, knew it was time for the grand finale. I turned around to see Julia practically running toward me, her face flushed and her eyes wide with something that looked suspiciously like panic. Wait, she called out. We need to talk about this. Talk about what? I asked, genuinely curious. You got exactly what you wanted. Divorce papers, signed and delivered. What's left to discuss? Behind her, the rest of the Collins family was spilling out of the restaurant like refugees fleeing a disaster zone. Margaret looked shell-shocked. Marcus kept running his hands through his hair, and Evelyn was trying to comfort Dave, who still seemed completely lost about what had just happened. This isn't how it was supposed to go, Julia said, and there was something almost childish in her voice, like she was complaining that I'd ruined her birthday party by not crying when she broke my favorite toy. How was it supposed to go exactly? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd been saving for exactly this moment. Were you expecting me to beg? Maybe cause a scene? Give you something dramatic to show your friends? Julia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind her, I could see Margaret approaching with the kind of determined stride that suggested she was about to try to take control of a situation that had already spiraled way beyond her ability to manage. Actually, I said, hitting the call button, since we're all here, this seems like the perfect time to clear up a few misconceptions. Rebecca Martinez answered on the second ring, because that's the kind of lawyer you get when you pay premium rates for premium service. Rebecca, it's done. They went through with it, just like we predicted. How do you want to handle the press release? She asked, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Press release, Julia whispered, and I realized the whole family had crowded close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. Let's go with the full package, I told Rebecca. Business valuation, government contracts, the works. And make sure you include the part about the charitable foundation we discussed. I hung up and looked at the circle of confused faces surrounding me. It was like Christmas morning, except instead of presents under the tree, I was about to unwrap 5 years of carefully hidden success. What press release? Margaret demanded, and for the first time since I'd known her, she actually looked uncertain. Instead of answering, I pulled out a manila envelope from my car, the same envelope I'd been carrying around for 3 days, waiting for exactly this moment. Inside were copies of everything Rebecca had prepared, Ridgewell Solutions' latest financial statements, the Department of Defense contract documentation, and my personal net worth analysis that would make their heads spin. Since we're sharing family paperwork tonight, I said, handing Margaret the envelope, I thought you might be interested in seeing what my small business actually looks like these days. Margaret opened the envelope with shaking hands, and I watched her face change as she read the first page. The color drained from her cheeks, her mouth fell open, and for a moment I thought she might actually faint right there on the sidewalk. $75 million, she whispered. That's just the government contract, I said cheerfully. The total company valuation is on page 3. Julia grabbed the papers from her mother's hands, scanning them frantically like she was looking for some kind of mistake or joke. When she got to the company valuation, $75 million and change, she actually stumbled backward. But you said, she started, then stopped. probably realizing that I'd never actually said anything about my business being small. That had been their assumption, their dismissive characterization, their way of making themselves feel superior. I said what? I asked. When did I ever tell you my company wasn't successful? Marcus snatched the papers next, his corporate-trained eyes scanning the financial data with the kind of desperate intensity of someone who'd just realized he'd been making fun of a guy who could buy and sell his entire company without breaking a sweat. This can't be right, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Oh, it gets better, I said, pulling out my phone again. Rebecca, could you send over those trust documents we discussed? I think my family would be interested to know where all that money is going. I hung up and smiled at their horrified faces. Did I mention that I updated my will last week? Everything goes to my niece Lily. Every penny. She's going to be quite wealthy when she turns 25. The silence that followed was even better than the one in the restaurant. Julia looked like she'd been hit by a truck. Margaret appeared to be having some kind of existential crisis, and Marcus was still staring at the financial documents like he could change the numbers through sheer force of will. You planned this, Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. No, I replied, walking toward my car. You did. You spent months plotting to get rid of the disappointing son-in-law, and congratulations, you succeeded. I'm free, I'm richer than ever, and thanks to that lovely pink envelope, I don't owe any of you a damn thing. I got in my car and rolled down the window for one final word. Oh, and Julia, good luck with that marketing job. I'm sure Marcus's friend will be very understanding when he finds out you just walked away from a $75 million marriage. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror, still standing there in the parking lot, probably trying to figure out how their brilliant plan had just made me the happiest man in the city. Walking out of Riversong Bistro that night wasn't just leaving a restaurant. It was stepping out of a prison I'd been living in for 5 years without even realizing the bars were there. The cool evening air hit my face, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I could actually breathe. I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, past all those perfect houses with their perfect lawns and their perfect families, and I couldn't stop laughing. Not the bitter, angry kind of laughter that comes when your world falls apart, but the genuine, from-the-belly kind that happens when you realize you've just won a game you didn't even know you were playing. The house felt different when I walked through the door. It was still the same overpriced colonial that Julia had insisted we needed to fit in with the neighborhood, still filled with the same furniture that Margaret had helped pick out, because family homes should reflect family values. But now it felt like what it really was, a stage set for a play that had finally ended. I poured myself that glass of Macallan I'd been promising myself and settled into my recliner. The one piece of furniture in the entire house that Julia had never managed to redecorate or replace with something more appropriate. Sitting there in the dark, sipping whiskey that cost more than most people's car payments, I tried to process what had just happened. They'd actually done it. After months of plotting and planning, weeks of secretive phone calls and conspiratorial meetings, they'd actually gone through with their elaborate scheme to destroy me publicly. And in doing so, they'd handed me the most beautiful gift imaginable, complete, total, irrevocable freedom from their toxic little dynasty. My phone started buzzing around midnight. Text messages from Julia, starting out angry and demanding, then shifting to confused and pleading, then finally settling into desperate bargaining. We need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. Mom didn't mean for it to happen like this. Can we please just discuss this like adults? I didn't answer any of them. What was there to discuss? They'd made their position crystal clear at dinner, and I'd accepted their terms completely. The only thing left was the paperwork, and Rebecca would handle that. The next few days were like Christmas morning extended into a long weekend. I woke up each day with this ridiculous grin on my face, unable to quite believe that I was actually free. No more family dinners where I was the punchline. No more Margaret's condescending comments about my cute little company. No more pretending to laugh at Marcus's corporate war stories or listening to Julia complain about how boring her life was. Rebecca called on Saturday morning with an update that made my day even better. The divorce papers they filed are actually going to work in our favor, she said, and I could hear the predatory satisfaction in her voice. They're asking for alimony based on your declared income from last year, which was essentially zero since everything was structured as corporate distributions. and they want half of your personal assets, which according to our documentation, amounts to about $15,000 in checking accounts and a car that's worth maybe 20 grand. What about the house? Corporate property, remember? You're technically a renter now. They can't touch it. I spent that weekend doing all the things I'd wanted to do, but couldn't because Julia would complain or Margaret would make some snide comment. I ordered pizza for breakfast, watched sports all day without having to share the remote, and played music loud enough that the neighbors probably thought I was having a midlife crisis. Maybe I was. But if so, it was the best damn midlife crisis in history. Monday morning brought the first real sign that the Collins family was starting to understand the magnitude of their fuck-up. Margaret showed up at my office, the first time she'd ever bothered to visit Ridgewell Solutions, looking like she'd aged about 10 years since Thursday night. My receptionist, Sarah, buzzed me from the front desk. "There's a Margaret Collins here to see you. She says it's urgent. Tell her I'm in meetings all day," I said. "And Sarah? If she comes back, I'm in meetings all week." But Margaret was persistent. I'll give her that. She waited in the lobby for 3 hours, probably hoping I'd cave and agree to see her. When that didn't work, she started calling every day, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that went from demanding to pleading to downright pathetic. "Please, we need to talk about this misunderstanding. Julia is devastated. She never wanted things to go this far. Maybe we can work something out that's fair for everyone." Julia's calls were even better. She'd gone from angry to confused to desperate in record time, probably as she started to understand what she'd actually thrown away. The messages got longer and more rambling as the days went on, like she was trying to talk herself into believing this was all some kind of mistake that could be fixed with the right combination of words. "I know you're upset, but we can fix this. Mom was just trying to help. She thought you'd be happier without the stress of marriage. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought this was what you wanted too. Please call me back. We need to discuss the practical aspects of this situation." The practical aspects. Right. Like how she was going to explain to her new corporate friends that she'd just walked away from more money than they'd ever see in their lifetimes. 2 weeks after my birthday dinner from hell, I closed on the penthouse. 42nd floor, downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave me a view of the entire city. The kind of place that screamed success so loudly you could hear it from the street. Moving day was therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. Packing up 5 years of marriage, sorting through all the accumulation of a life I'd never really wanted, deciding what was worth keeping and what could be left behind for Julia to deal with. The photo albums went in the trash. The wedding gifts from Margaret's friends went to charity. The furniture that Julia had picked out to impress her mother got donated to a homeless shelter, where it would actually serve a purpose. I kept 3 things from the house: my clothes, my books, and that recliner. Everything else was just props from a play I was never auditioning for again. The penthouse felt like coming home in a way that suburban colonial never had. Clean lines, modern furniture, space to breathe and think without someone else's opinion about how I should live my life. I set up my home office in the room with the best view, looking out over the city I'd conquered while my ex-family thought I was failing. Julia tried visiting once, about a month after I'd moved out. The doorman called up to announce her, and I could hear the desperation in his voice as he relayed her message. "She says it's very important, Mr. Ridgewell. Something about urgent family matters. Tell her there are no family matters anymore," I said. "And if she comes back, call security." That was 6 months ago. 6 months of waking up every morning in my own space, making my own decisions, living my own life without someone else's family treating me like a disappointment. 6 months of building my business even bigger, traveling to places Julia always said were too expensive or too impractical, and rediscovering who I was when I wasn't trying to live up to someone else's expectations. The irony is perfect. Margaret spent 5 years trying to convince Julia that she'd married beneath her station, that I was holding her back from the life she deserved. And in the end, she was right. I was holding Julia back. But not from success or happiness or any of the things Margaret thought mattered. I was holding her back from finding out exactly how much money she could have walked away from if she'd just treated her husband with basic respect. Their envelope, meant to destroy me, had given me exactly what I wanted all along. A life where I didn't have to pretend to be grateful for their contempt. Freedom, finally. And it felt fucking fantastic.